I never imagined that a simple garage could turn into a battlefield. But that's exactly what happened the day Karen moved into our neighborhood. At first I thought, she's probably just a normal neighbor. But oh no, normal didn't even come close to describing Karen. She's that type of person who thinks the world revolves around her. Middle-aged, curly blonde hair that always seems perfectly styled no matter what, and a bright red blouse she wears like a warning sign. And that smile. The one that says, "Rules, I make the rules." It started small. The first time I came home from work, there she was. Her car was in my garage. I froze for a second, thinking maybe I had parked in the wrong house. But no, this was my garage, my space, my peace. I knocked on her door, trying to be polite, hoping maybe it was an innocent mistake. She answered with that grin, tilting her head like I was the crazy one. "Oh, hi, I thought, well, I just needed to park for a little while," she said. I wanted to laugh, but instead I just smiled stiffly and said, "It's my garage, Karen, please move your car." She looked at me as if I'd asked her to give up her entire life savings. And yet, she moved her car for now. I thought maybe that would be the end of it. I thought maybe she'd learn, but the universe has a sense of humor. The very next week, same time, same situation, she was back in my garage, smiling like she'd won some secret victory. I could feel my blood pressure rising. My heart was pounding, not just from anger, but from disbelief. How could someone be so audacious? I tried to laugh it off at first. Maybe she just really likes my garage, I muttered to myself. But by the third time, any shred of humor was gone. I realized something. Karen wasn't just parking in my garage. She was testing me. She was pushing boundaries, and I had two options: keep letting her walk all over me or take control. I tried every polite method I could think of: notes on her windshield, friendly knocks on her door, even casual, "Hey, Karen, just a reminder," conversations. She smiled through every attempt, each time looking more pleased with herself. That's when I felt it, the exact moment my patience cracked. I knew then that if I didn't act, this would never stop. And Karen didn't understand the word no. But I'm not the type to explode in anger. I'm methodical, I think ahead, and that's exactly what I did. I started planning, not revenge, well, maybe a little, but clever, satisfying, and undeniable. I wanted Karen to realize that she couldn't just waltz into someone else's life and expect no consequences, and I had two surprises in mind. The first one was simple, immediate, and very satisfying. The second, well, that one would be unforgettable. I spent that night imagining the look on her face the next morning. Her confidence, that smug sense of entitlement, would meet reality in a way she didn't expect. I could almost hear her screams, her frantic attempts, the flustered expressions she'd make as she realized, finally, that the rules applied to her too. It was exhilarating. By the time I went to bed, I couldn't sleep. Every plan, every scenario played out in my mind like a suspense thriller. I pictured her pulling up, thinking she owned the place, and then, bam! Surprise number one, right in her face. I knew she'd never forget it. And the thought of her scrambling, yelling, perhaps even involving the HOA, made me grin uncontrollably. The tension of what was coming was delicious, a slow-burning excitement that kept me awake until dawn. The next morning, I got up early, dressed casually, and went to the window. Karen's car wasn't there yet, but I knew it would be. I sipped my coffee, listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood waking up. My heartbeat accelerated. This wasn't just about a garage anymore. It was about standing my ground, reclaiming my peace, and teaching Karen a lesson she couldn't ignore. And when she finally appeared, blissfully unaware of what awaited her, I knew that life was about to get a little chaotic. Because Karen didn't just park in my garage. She parked herself right in the middle of a storm she had no idea was coming. The morning started quietly, but I could feel the tension in the air. I knew she was coming. I could almost hear the screech of her tires as she turned the corner, confident as ever, thinking the garage, and by extension me, was hers for the taking. And there it was, her car, shining obnoxiously in the morning sun, inching toward my driveway like it owned the place. My stomach twisted with a mix of irritation and anticipation. This was the moment. I walked outside casually, trying to appear calm, but inside I was buzzing. My mind replayed every failed, polite attempt from the last week. Every knock, every note, every forced smile. I'd been testing my patience for too long. And now it was time to see just how Karen would react when she finally met someone who refused to bend. "Good morning, Karen," I called, keeping my voice as neutral as possible. Neutral but firm. She looked up from adjusting her seatbelt and grinned at me like she'd just won a game I didn't even know we were playing. "Oh, hey," she said, stepping out of her car, her heels clicking against the driveway. "I thought I could just park here for a quick second." I stopped her right there, letting the silence stretch for a moment, long enough to let her realize she was in my territory. "Karen, this is my garage," I said slowly. "Again." Her smile faltered slightly, replaced by that faint flicker of irritation that I'd been waiting for. She opened her mouth to argue, to explain, to assert her self-proclaimed superiority, but I cut her off. "I've asked politely before. I've left notes. I've tried to reason with you. None of it worked. You need to leave now." She tilted her head, as if studying me to see if I was bluffing. "No, Karen," I interrupted, stepping a little closer. "This is private property. You cannot just decide it belongs to you." Her eyes widened, her nostrils flared. And then the classic Karen move. She huffed and started listing every reason in the world why she should be allowed to park here. HOA rules, friendly neighborhood norms, some ridiculous story about her friend's dog needing a quick walk. I let her ramble, silently savoring every word. The more she spoke, the more absurd she sounded. It was almost like watching a cartoon character come to life in front of me. I could feel the tension rising, not just hers, but mine too. My hands itched to grab a cup of coffee or pace around, just to release some of the nervous energy, but I stood my ground. This was a showdown, and deep down I knew I was about to win. Finally, she paused, realizing I wasn't budging. That's when I saw the first crack in her armor. Her confident smile faltered into something closer to panic. Maybe just for a few minutes," she stammered, clearly grasping for any argument that could salvage her pride. I raised an eyebrow, keeping my tone calm, almost conspiratorial. "Karen, I don't think you understand. You're not leaving voluntarily this time. I have plans." I didn't say more, but the look in my eyes was enough to make her pause. And that pause, that tiny, hesitation-filled pause, was exactly what I wanted. She blinked, her mouth opened and closed, searching for words. The frustration was radiating off her in waves, almost visible like heat rising from asphalt. I could barely hold back a smirk. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the pivot point where her confidence collided with reality. Without warning, she turned and stomped back toward her car, muttering threats under her breath. "I'm calling the HOA. I'm filing complaints. You'll regret this." But the seed had been planted. She had no idea that this confrontation was only the beginning. As she drove off, red-faced and steaming with rage, I felt a mix of triumph and anticipation. The first surprise was already in motion, and she didn't even know it. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the excitement bubbling inside me. I knew the next few hours would be a test, not of my patience, but of her persistence. And deep down, I relished the thought that the neighborhood might get to witness a little chaos unfold. Karen had been so sure she could waltz through life without consequences, and now the real fun was about to start. Because this wasn't just about a garage anymore. This was about boundaries, about standing up, and about delivering a lesson that Karen would never forget. And I couldn't wait to see the look on her face when the first surprise hit. The next morning, I woke up with a strange mix of excitement and nerves. I had planned everything down to the smallest detail. This wasn't about revenge in a mean-spirited way. It was about sending a message. You can't walk all over people and expect no consequences. And Karen, well, she was about to learn that lesson the hard way. I poured myself a cup of coffee and looked out the window, scanning the street. The neighborhood was still waking up, birds chirping, the occasional dog barking. And then I saw it, her car barreling toward my driveway like a missile. She looked completely confident, as if nothing had changed. That confidence was her weakness, and I was ready to exploit it. I went to the garage and checked the smart lock I had installed the night before. Simple, effective, foolproof. Karen had no idea it existed. To anyone else, it was just a regular garage door. To me, it was the perfect trap. I pressed the button on my phone, and the garage door clicked softly into the locked position. I could barely hide my grin. She arrived, stepped out of her car, and immediately went to open the garage. Her hand hit the handle, then pulled again. Nothing. She pressed the button on her garage remote. Nothing. I could hear her muttering to herself, growing louder with each failed attempt. She tried jiggling the handle, yanking at it like brute force could override technology. I leaned against the window, sipping my coffee, my heart racing with anticipation. "Oh, come on, this isn't funny," she shouted, finally realizing something was very wrong. I stayed silent, enjoying the chaos unfolding in front of me. Her face went from confusion to frustration to full-blown panic within seconds. She tried calling me, but I ignored the phone. She pounded on the garage door, screamed threats about calling the HOA, and even mentioned the police. I almost laughed out loud. Her tantrum was getting more dramatic by the second. I could hear the neighbors peeking out their windows, probably wondering what disaster had befallen Karen this time. She stomped around, waving her arms, shouting to anyone who would listen. I almost felt sorry for her, almost. But then she kicked my trash cans, and I realized sympathy wasn't part of the plan. I decided to escalate the tension just a little. I stepped outside, keeping my voice calm, almost soothing. "Karen, you might want to sit down. This is going to take a while." Her eyes widened, then narrowed. "What do you mean, sit down? This is ridiculous," she yelled. I let a tiny smile slip through. The point wasn't cruelty, it was clarity, boundaries, lessons, reality. After several more minutes of her frantic attempts, she finally slammed the car door and stormed to her neighbor's house, probably hoping someone could rescue her from her personal nightmare. I stood there, savoring the moment. My heart was still pounding, but I felt a strange satisfaction. The first surprise had worked perfectly. She had no idea what I had planned next. I went back inside and sat down, thinking ahead. This was only the beginning. Karen would come back, she would try again. And when she did, the second surprise would hit, something bigger, more surprising and unforgettable. I could already picture her face when it happened. Shock, confusion, maybe even terror mixed with outrage. It would be the kind of reaction that people remember for years. By mid-morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. Whispers of what happened spread quickly. A few neighbors stopped by to see if I was okay, some trying to contain laughter as they recounted what they'd seen. I waved politely, pretending I had no idea what they were talking about, but inside I was grinning. Karen had become the talk of the street, all because she had ignored a simple rule: respect other people's property. As I sipped my coffee, I realized something important. Standing up for yourself doesn't have to involve anger or shouting or fighting. Sometimes it's about strategy, timing, patience, and a little bit of clever planning. Karen had taught me that lesson in her own way by testing my limits, and now I was about to teach her in mine. Because the garage wasn't just a garage anymore. It was a battlefield, and Karen, she had just lost the first skirmish. The tension was delicious, the anticipation electric. And as I watched the empty driveway, I knew one thing: the next time Karen tried to make herself at home in my garage, she wouldn't just be frustrated. She'd be stunned, completely unprepared, and I could hardly wait to see it happen. By the time Karen realized the first surprise had worked, I knew it wouldn't be long before she escalated things. And escalate she did. Within a day, my phone started buzzing nonstop. Texts, emails, even a formal-looking letter slid under my door from the HOA. Apparently, Karen had decided this garage incident was not just a personal affront. It was a neighborhood crisis. When the HOA board showed up, I could barely keep a straight face. 3 people, clipboards in hand, looking like they had been briefed for a hostage negotiation rather than a suburban parking dispute. They introduced themselves politely, trying to sound serious, and asked me to explain what happened. I started calmly, recounting Karen's repeated trespasses, her refusal to respect boundaries, and of course, the locked garage door that had flustered her beyond belief. Karen, who had followed them over in full, outraged victim mode, interrupted immediately. "This is harassment. This is unfair. He's deliberately trying to torment me," she shrieked, waving her hands like a conductor leading a symphony of chaos. I could see the HOA board exchanging confused glances, clearly unsure whose side they were supposed to take. One of them muttered under his breath, "Is this real?" And I almost laughed out loud. I stayed calm, letting her tantrum unfold like a live comedy show. She listed every grievance imaginable, that I had intimidated her, that the garage door incident was humiliating, that she had rights I was ignoring. I nodded politely at each accusation, responding with measured, factual explanations. "Karen, you're on my property. You parked in my garage. I did nothing illegal. You are free to use your driveway or the street, but the garage is mine." The board looked at me like I had just delivered a perfectly logical argument in a courtroom drama. Karen, meanwhile, was growing more and more unhinged. "I'm going to call the city," she yelled. "I'm going to sue you," one board member whispered. "Maybe you should just let her park there," but I ignored him. The moment I saw Karen's face turn bright red with anger, I knew I had them right where I wanted them, completely exposed in her own ridiculousness. Neighbors had started gathering quietly, peeking through blinds or standing at the edge of their lawns. I could hear stifled laughter from somewhere down the street. Karen, too wrapped up in her rage to notice, continued her dramatic performance. "This is a disaster. I've never been treated like this in my entire life," she shouted. The HOA board looked uncomfortable. I think a few were even second-guessing how they had volunteered to handle this nonsense. After 10 minutes of her shouting, I finally interrupted calmly. "Karen, if you continue to park in my garage, it will be considered trespassing. I suggest you leave now before it escalates further." She froze, her jaw twitching. The board looked between us, sensing that something strategic was happening. They could see the tension, the stakes, the sheer absurdity of the situation. Karen stomped back to her car, muttering threats under her breath, and the board quietly thanked me for my cooperation before shuffling off. I watched them go, feeling a strange mix of triumph and amusement. The first surprise had rattled her, and now the second was already forming in my mind. It was going to be bigger, more elaborate, and completely unforgettable. I couldn't help but laugh quietly to myself. Karen thought she could manipulate the system, twist rules, and bully her way into my garage. But she had underestimated patience, planning, and a little bit of clever ingenuity. I sat back on my porch, coffee in hand, imagining the next encounter. Karen had been exposed for what she really was, entitled, impulsive, and completely unprepared for someone who wouldn't back down. The funny part, the neighborhood was watching and they were enjoying it. Every peep of laughter, every whispered conversation, every shake of a head as Karen stormed off. It was like watching a live sitcom unfold right outside my window. And the best part, they didn't even know the second surprise was coming. I felt a thrill of anticipation. The first surprise had been small but effective. The second would be the game changer, the moment that would truly cement the lesson. Karen didn't know it yet, but her confidence, her arrogance, and her insistence on ignoring rules were about to collide with reality in a way she would never forget. I sipped my coffee, smiling to myself, and whispered under my breath, "You have no idea what's coming, Karen. No idea at all." The stage was set. The players were in place. And the next time she tried to make my garage her personal parking lot, everything would change. After the HOA fiasco, I realized something very important. Karen was relentless. She didn't just park in my garage. She tested me, challenged me, and seemed to thrive on the chaos she caused. But that meant I had to be smarter, quicker, and above all, strategic. The first surprise had rattled her, yes, but it was only the beginning. The second surprise, well, that would be unforgettable. That evening, I sat in my living room, running through every possible scenario. I had to create something clever, subtle, yet undeniably effective. Something that would leave her stunned, confused, maybe even questioning her own sanity. I wanted it to be legal, harmless, but impossible to ignore. It had to teach her a lesson without crossing the line into revenge that could get me in trouble. I looked out the window at my garage, imagining her arriving tomorrow morning with the same smug confidence she always carried. The thought made me grin. This time she wouldn't just be frustrated. She'd be shocked, completely unprepared. The anticipation was almost unbearable. I could feel my pulse quicken at the thought of her reaction. As I brainstormed, I thought about the little details that made Karen so Karen. Her vanity, her entitlement, her inability to admit she was wrong. Everything had to hit those weak spots. I visualized the scenario perfectly. Her arrival, the confusion, her futile attempts to resolve it, and the complete realization that she had underestimated me. I could almost hear the panic in her voice, the frantic muttering as she tried to salvage her dignity. I even started imagining the neighbors watching, trying to suppress their laughter. Some would peek out from behind curtains, others would casually stroll past, pretending not to notice while secretly enjoying the show. The idea of Karen performing her own little meltdown right in front of an audience made me chuckle quietly to myself. But I had to be patient. Timing was everything. I needed the setup to be perfect. I gathered a few tools, some items to subtly rearrange, and a small obstacle that would be just enough to slow her down without causing damage. It wasn't about hurting her car or anything like that. It was about creating confusion and surprise, forcing her to confront her own arrogance. As night fell, I went over the plan one more time. I imagined her waking up, leaving her house, confident as ever, and then, bam! Reality would hit her like a ton of bricks. She would fume, she would stomp, she would shout, and I would watch silently, savoring the moment. This was going to be one of those legendary suburban stories people talk about for weeks. I could practically hear the whispers already. Did you see what she did to Karen? I also thought about my own excitement. There's a strange thrill in plotting something clever, in watching someone who thinks they are untouchable finally meet resistance. It wasn't about cruelty. It was about standing up for myself, taking control and reclaiming what was mine. And in Karen's case, it was also about teaching her that boundaries exist, whether she likes them or not. By the time I went to bed, I couldn't sleep. Every detail of the plan ran through my mind from start to finish. I pictured her arrival, her confusion, the subtle obstacle that would stop her in her tracks, and the comedic, almost cinematic meltdown that would follow. I imagined the HOA getting wind of it, neighbors laughing quietly, and Karen scrambling to regain control, only to realize she had no power over the situation. And as I drifted off to sleep, a single thought lingered in my mind. This wasn't just about a garage anymore. This was about reclaiming peace, asserting boundaries, and proving that no matter how entitled someone thinks they are, there are always consequences waiting for them. The next morning, Karen would return. She had no idea what was coming, and when she did, it would be more than a simple inconvenience. It would be a lesson delivered with precision and unforgettable in every way. Because Karen didn't just park in my garage. She parked herself right in the path of a storm she couldn't even see yet, and I was ready. The next morning, I woke up early, heart racing. Today was the day. Karen had no idea what awaited her, and the thought made me both nervous and exhilarated. I sipped my coffee slowly, watching the street through the kitchen window. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet. I knew she was about to arrive, full of confidence, ready to assert her right to my garage. Sure enough, 15 minutes later, I heard the familiar roar of her car engine. She pulled into the driveway, perfectly oblivious, humming to herself as if she owned the place. I could feel my pulse quicken. This was it. Every detail I had prepared last night was about to come into play. I stepped outside, acting casual, like I had no idea she was about to meet her second surprise. She stepped out of the car, flashing that same arrogant grin she always wore. "Good morning," she chirped. "I just need to park for a minute." Before she could finish, she froze. Her eyes widened. She took a cautious step forward and then stopped again. That's when I saw it. The subtle, perfectly placed obstacle I had arranged the night before. Nothing damaging, just something that made it physically impossible for her to get her car into the garage. And yet it was enough to throw her completely off balance. What is this?" she stammered, her confident tone cracking. She tried to move forward, her hands fumbling at the wheel, but the car wouldn't budge. She jumped out, scanning the driveway, looking around like she had entered some alternate reality. Her panic grew with every second. I stayed calm, leaning against the garage door, coffee in hand, trying not to laugh too loudly. "Having trouble, Karen?" I asked innocently. She spun around, face red, voice shaking. "This isn't fair, this is harassment, you can't do this." I shook my head, keeping my tone gentle, almost parental. "Karen, it's just a driveway, you've been warned. You chose to ignore the rules, now you're experiencing the consequences." Her arms flailed and she stomped around the car like a cartoon character. "I'm calling the HOA, I'm calling the city, this is illegal," she screamed. I just nodded politely. Let her panic. Let her realize that her entitlement had limits. Meanwhile, neighbors started appearing, drawn by the commotion. Some peeked from behind curtains, others leaned on their fences, trying not to laugh out loud. A few waved at me discreetly, giving little thumbs-ups. The tension was electric. Karen's meltdown had become a neighborhood spectacle, and I was at the center, calm, collected, and fully in control. She tried moving the obstacle, shifting it slightly, muttering curses, and even attempted to reverse her car. Nothing worked. Her confidence had crumbled completely, replaced by frustration, confusion, and an intense, almost cinematic desperation. Finally, she stomped away from the car, hands on her hips, muttering threats that no one could hear over her furious muttering. I stayed where I was, sipping my coffee, feeling an odd mix of triumph and amusement. The first surprise rattled her. The second had blown her mind. She had no idea how clever, harmless, and perfectly orchestrated it all had been. I could see the lesson settling in. Karen's arrogance, her refusal to respect boundaries, her overconfidence, it all collided with reality in a way that left her completely powerless. And the best part? She had no one to blame but herself. Every choice she had made, every rule she had ignored led to this very moment. As the adrenaline faded, I realized something. Standing up for yourself doesn't have to involve yelling, threats, or confrontation. Sometimes it's about strategy, patience, and creativity. And in Karen's case, it was about a little bit of theater, timed perfectly to make a point. By the time she finally drove away, car parked awkwardly, defeated and muttering to herself, the street had returned to calm. Neighbors returned to their routines, probably laughing quietly among themselves, while I stood on my porch, smiling. The garage was mine again. My space, my rules, my peace. And Karen, well, she had just learned the hard way that boundaries exist, even in suburban neighborhoods. And I knew deep down that while this battle was won, Karen would probably try something again. But this time I was ready. I had the upper hand, I had strategy, and I had patience. Because the garage wasn't just a garage anymore. It was my territory, my fortress, and Karen, she was a cautionary tale in the making. I thought the storm had passed. Karen had been thoroughly rattled by the second surprise, her ego bruised, her confidence shattered. For a few quiet days, I enjoyed the peace. My garage was finally mine. I parked without anxiety. I walked down the driveway without fear. Life felt normal again, but of course this is Karen we're talking about. Normal doesn't exist in her vocabulary. It started with texts, short, angry, and passive-aggressive. "This isn't over," she typed. "You'll regret this. HOA will hear about you." I chuckled. I had expected something like this. Karen had always been the type to escalate, to fight tooth and nail when she thought she was wronged. But here's the thing, escalating against me wasn't going to work. I had strategy, patience, and the neighborhood quietly rooting for me. The next day, she showed up in person, a determined storm cloud of fury. I saw her from my porch before she even reached the driveway. She looked ready to storm the neighborhood council, call the police, or perhaps even challenge the laws of physics if it meant reclaiming her perceived territory. I braced myself, expecting an epic confrontation. "I'm calling the city," she shouted, stomping toward my garage. "You can't just do this to people." I stepped outside calmly, hands in my pockets, smiling faintly. "Karen, I understand you're upset, but let's be honest, you brought this on yourself. The garage is private property. You ignored repeated warnings. This is what happens." Her face twisted, a mixture of rage and disbelief. "This is harassment. You think you can just make my life miserable? I'm going to make you pay." I nodded slowly, keeping my tone light, almost teasing. "Oh, Karen, you think that's possible? You really think you can escalate this further? I have a feeling the only person making themselves miserable here is, well, you." And then it began. The threats, the calls, the messages, she tried everything. She went to the HOA, she posted online, she even attempted to rally neighbors to her cause. But every effort backfired spectacularly. People were tired of her antics. They were laughing quietly behind their blinds, shaking their heads. Her social media posts turned into jokes. Even the HOA started ignoring her calls because she had become, in their words, a one-woman drama production. I watched her spiral like a slow-motion disaster. Every time she tried to regain control, her plans fell apart. I had anticipated her bravado, her arrogance, her need to dominate. And every time she acted, I stayed calm, neutral, and unshakable. That's when I realized Karen's power came from her confidence. Remove that, and there was nothing left. Neighbors began to comment subtly, making little jokes, exchanging knowing glances. Karen noticed, of course, which only added fuel to her frenzy. She had become a spectacle, a cartoonish villain in a suburban comedy she didn't realize she was starring in. And the best part? I didn't have to lift a finger. My smart planning, patience, and a little creativity had done all the work. By the end of the week, she tried one final tactic. She called the HOA again, demanding some sort of official intervention. But even they refused to get involved. Karen's credibility had eroded so completely that her threats fell on deaf ears. It was almost poetic. Every attempt to regain control ended in embarrassment. Every strategy she thought would succeed failed spectacularly. And as she drove away, red-faced, muttering under her breath, I realized something important. This wasn't just about a garage anymore. It was about boundaries, patience, and standing your ground. Karen had tested me, yes. She had tried to push me to the edge. But in the end, it was her own choices, her own arrogance, and her inability to respect rules that had undone her. I took a deep breath, feeling a rare kind of satisfaction. The garage was mine. The neighborhood was calm again. And Karen, she had learned, whether she admitted it or not, that some battles aren't worth fighting, especially when the person on the other side is prepared, clever, and a little bit unstoppable. As I watched her car disappear down the street, I couldn't help but smile. This story wasn't just about victory. It was about strategy, patience, and the quiet satisfaction of watching entitlement collide with reality. And I knew, deep down, that Karen's reputation as the neighborhood terror had been permanently softened, at least a little, by the experience. The storm had passed, the garage was mine, and peace, sweet, well-earned peace, finally returned. By now, I thought the chaos was finally over. Karen had been humbled, or at least temporarily neutralized. My garage was mine again, my driveway peaceful, and the neighborhood slowly returning to normal. But as anyone who has ever dealt with a Karen knows, you can't predict what they'll do next. You just have to be ready for anything. The next morning, I stepped outside cautiously, half expecting another stunt. But instead, I was greeted by quiet streets and neighbors who waved politely as they went about their business. The first thought that crossed my mind was maybe, just maybe, it was finally over. I could park without anxiety, walk outside without fear, and sip my coffee without imagining the next confrontation. I felt an unusual sense of calm. Then I saw her, Karen, across the street, standing on her porch, hands on her hips, glaring at me like a storm cloud waiting to unload. But this time, she wasn't rushing toward my garage. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't waving her arms or threatening the HOA. She just stared, furious, frustrated, and most importantly, defeated. I waved politely just to test the waters. She didn't wave back. She just muttered something under her breath, then went back inside. I felt a strange mixture of triumph and relief. She had finally understood that some battles aren't worth fighting when the other person is calm, prepared, and unshakable. As the days went by, her presence faded. She still occasionally peered out her window, likely plotting her next move, but the frequency of her garage attempts and her ridiculous confrontations dropped to zero. The neighbors had learned to smirk quietly at the memory of her tantrums. I even heard a few stories of her trying to warn newcomers about me, which only made them laugh when they realized she was exaggerating everything. I reflected on the whole ordeal while sitting on my porch one evening. It had been stressful, yes. Humiliating sometimes in the pure absurdity of it all. But it had also taught me something valuable. Standing your ground doesn't require anger, shouting, or aggression. Sometimes it requires patience, strategy, and a little bit of creativity. And maybe a dash of humor, especially when dealing with someone like Karen. I could still hear her voice in my head from the first day. "This is unfair. You can't do this to me." The absurdity of it all made me chuckle quietly to myself. Life is full of challenges, and sometimes the people who seem impossible to deal with can teach you the most important lessons in the strangest ways. I walked into the garage and ran my hand along my car, a small, victorious smile creeping across my face. This space, this simple, ordinary garage had become a symbol of boundaries, patience, and quiet victories. Karen might have thought she was in control, but in reality she had played right into my plan, and I had learned something even more important. You don't need to stoop to someone else's level to win. You just need to stay clever, stay calm, and let reality do the work. Over the next few weeks, life returned to its normal rhythm. Karen occasionally waved, sometimes angrily, sometimes sheepishly, but the power dynamic had shifted. My garage was mine, my driveway was peaceful, and the neighborhood slowly forgot the spectacle that had unfolded. And I felt a quiet satisfaction that's hard to describe. Not just because I had outsmarted her, but because I had maintained my composure, my boundaries, and my dignity throughout the entire ordeal. Sometimes I still see her glance across the street and I can't help but smile. Not out of cruelty, but out of recognition. The lesson had been learned. Karen had met her match in patience, strategy, and a little clever mischief. And in the end, that was all I had ever wanted: peace, my garage, and a neighborhood that could breathe without her chaos. Because this wasn't just a story about a garage. It was a story about boundaries, resilience, and the quiet satisfaction of standing your ground. Karen taught me that some people will push, test, and challenge, but with strategy, humor, and patience, even the most entitled neighbor can be managed. And so life returned to normal. My garage doors opened and closed without worry. I could finally relax, knowing that I had handled the situation with intelligence and calm. Karen might never fully understand the lesson, but the neighborhood did, and sometimes that's enough. I took a deep breath, leaning back on the porch, and thought to myself, some victories aren't loud, they're quiet, clever, and lasting. And in my little corner of the world, that victory was mine. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.